Douglas Hartwell picked up Andre Whitmore's 47-page report, looked at it for 30 seconds, and dropped it back on the table like it was a grocery receipt. "Andre," he clasped his hands, "you're a good mechanic, but this isn't your lane." A mechanic, 11 years, 2 engineering degrees, 4 months of calculations that 3 departments couldn't disprove. And that was the word the VP of engineering chose. Mechanic. Andre didn't argue. He picked up his report, walked out of that building, and carried a cardboard box to his truck. 9 years later, NASA called. Not Hartwell, not Meridian, not one of the 32 engineers who'd spent 3 years missing exactly what Andre had found in his spare time. NASA. Because the billion-dollar spacecraft they'd launched was dying, and the only man alive who understood why was the one they'd thrown away. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. And if it hits subscribe, you won't want to miss what comes next. The knock on the metal door came at 6:47 in the morning. Andre Whitmore heard it from underneath a John Deere tractor that had been dead for 3 weeks. He was lying flat on a creeper board, a flashlight clenched between his teeth, tracing a hydraulic line that some previous mechanic had routed in a way that defied basic physics. His knuckles were already bleeding from where he'd scraped them on a bolt housing 20 minutes earlier. His back ached. His coffee was cold on the workbench. How was by every visible measure exactly what the world had decided he was: a scrap mechanic. The knock came again. 3 sharp raps. Impatient. Official. Andre didn't move right away. He finished tracing the hydraulic line to the junction he suspected confirmed what he already knew, and then slowly rolled himself out from under the machine, wiping his hands on a rag that was more oil than cloth at this point. He stood up. 3 people were standing just inside the open bay door of his garage, and they were so obviously out of place that it almost would have been funny under different circumstances. 2 men and a woman. Business clothes. Laptop bags. The kind of shoes that had never walked on gravel. The woman was holding a sealed file folder against her chest, like it was something precious. One of the men was looking at the stacks of engine parts along the wall, with an expression that sat somewhere between fascination and barely disguised contempt. Andre pulled the flashlight from his mouth and clicked it off. "We're closed." "Mr. Whitmore." The woman stepped forward. She was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed, and the way she carried herself told Andre immediately that she was someone used to being the smartest person in most rooms. "My name is Dr. Evelyn Carter. I'm a senior systems engineer with NASA's Propulsion and Structural Integration Division." "Good for you. We need to speak with you." "About what?" She hesitated for exactly 1 second, which was the only crack in her composure he'd see for the next hour. "About a problem we can't solve." Andre looked at her, then at the 2 men behind her, then at the folder she was holding. He walked to the workbench, picked up his cold coffee, and took a long sip. "I've got a tractor to finish," he said. "Farmer needs it back by noon. You want to talk, you talk while I work." Nobody who drove past Andre Whitmore's garage on Route 9 would have guessed what they were driving past. It didn't look like anything significant. A converted auto shop, maybe 40 years old, with a hand-painted sign that said, "Whitmore Repair All Machines," above the bay door. The parking lot was cracked asphalt with a few weeds pushing through. There was always something sitting outside, waiting: a broken tiller, a seized boat motor, a generator with a cracked casing. The kind of machines that nobody else would touch anymore because the parts were discontinued or the repair wasn't worth the labor. Andre touched all of them. The people who brought their machines to him weren't doing it because they had a lot of money. They were doing it because they had no money. Farmers who couldn't afford a new piece of equipment. Small businesses running on machinery that was 15 years past its warranty. Old men who had a truck they'd driven for 200,000 miles and weren't ready to let go of it. Andre fixed everything. And he charged what people could afford. What the world outside his garage didn't know, and what he made no effort to advertise, was that fixing broken farm equipment was not the ceiling of what Andre Whitmore could do. It was the floor, beneath the workbench. Beneath the socket sets and the hydraulic fluid and the grease-stained repair manuals there were notebooks, dozens of them, filled from cover to cover in handwriting so small and precise that you needed good light to read it. Thermal dynamics calculations. Vibration frequency analyses. Structural load modeling. Failure probability matrices that could have come out of a graduate-level aerospace engineering program. Because they had. Andre Whitmore held 2 degrees, a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech, and a master's in aerospace systems design from MIT. He had spent 11 years working in private aerospace, rising to lead designer at a company called Meridian Aerospace Systems, one of the fastest-growing defense and space contractors in the Southeast. He had been very good at his job. He had also been very inconvenient for his company. And so 9 years ago, he had been made to disappear. If you asked people at Meridian Aerospace Systems about Andre Whitmore today, most of them would look uncomfortable and change the subject. The few who would talk about him would say something vague, that he was difficult to work with, that he had trouble fitting into the culture, that it was a personnel decision, not a technical one. They would not tell you about the report. In 2016, when Andre was 36 years old and at the peak of his engineering career, he submitted a formal technical report to Meridian's senior leadership team. 47 pages, single-spaced, meticulously documented. The report identified a critical design flaw in the structural resonance management system of a next-generation propulsion unit that Meridian was developing for a joint government contract. The flaw was subtle. It wouldn't show up in standard testing. It required understanding how 3 separate subsystems interacted with each other under specific dynamic conditions. Conditions that would only occur during a particular phase of operation that the standard test protocols didn't simulate. Andre had found it by spending 4 months working through the math in his spare time evenings and weekends after something in the vibration data during a routine system check had nagged at him in a way he couldn't explain and couldn't let go. He had done the work on his own time. He had checked it 4 different ways. He had triple verified every assumption, and then he had walked it upstairs. The first meeting did not go well. They didn't attack the math, Andre said once, years later, to his daughter, when she was old enough to understand. They never attacked the math, because they couldn't. The math was right. They attacked me. The VP of Engineering, a man named Douglas Hartwell, looked at the report for approximately 90 seconds before putting it down on the conference table and asking Andre what his professional experience was with resonance management systems specifically. Andre told him. Hartwell nodded slowly, in the way that people nod when they have already decided not to listen to what they're hearing. And you did this analysis independently, outside of a formal review process. I brought it to the formal review process by bringing it here. Yes, but this wasn't commissioned work. This was something you did on your own time, based on a feeling. Based on anomalous vibration data and 4 months of structural analysis. The third person in the room was a man named Richard Calloway, who was Meridian's Director of Program Development, and who Andre had always understood to be a man primarily concerned with schedules and budgets, and not very much else. Calloway leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Andre, I appreciate the diligence here, I genuinely do. But we have a government delivery deadline in 8 months. We have a team of 32 engineers who have been working this system for 3 years. Are you telling me that in your personal time working alone, you found something that 32 professional engineers and 3 years of formal testing missed? Yes, Andre said. That's exactly what I'm telling you. The silence in the room was the kind that has a temperature. I'll tell you what we'll do, Hartwell said, in the tone of a man who has already written the end of the meeting in his head. We'll have the review team take a look at your analysis and flag anything that warrants a formal response. Andre looked at him. And the timeline. Andre. Calloway's voice dropped half a register the way it does when someone is about to say something they're going to be careful about. We're confident in our engineers. Let the process work. Andre left the meeting with his 47-page report still sitting on the conference table. Nobody picked it up. Andre didn't give up after that first meeting. He requested follow-up meetings. He sent emails with supplementary data. He brought in a colleague, a thermal systems engineer named Patricia Moran, who was one of the few people in the building who took him seriously to review his work independently. Patricia reviewed it. She agreed with every finding. She wrote her own summary memo and submitted it through her supervisor. It never went anywhere. What did go somewhere and quickly was the news that Andre Whitmore was causing problems, that he was being difficult, that he had some kind of personal agenda or chip on his shoulder. The informal conversations, the hallway talk, the lunch table whispers began shaping a narrative that had nothing to do with structural resonance management systems and everything to do with Andre Whitmore as a personality problem. He heard things. Some directly, some through the grapevine. He thinks he knows more than the whole team. It's like he's trying to prove something. He didn't even go through the right channels. He went through every channel. He documented every channel he went through. He also noticed during those 3 months which meetings he stopped being invited to, which project updates he stopped receiving, which conversations got quieter when he walked into a room. He recognized what was happening. He had seen it happen to other people. He had hoped it wouldn't happen to him. His then-wife Denise saw it in his face every evening when he came home. She would watch him eat dinner in silence, chewing slowly, not tasting anything, and she knew without asking that the day had been another day of being erased. "You need to let it go," she told him one night. "I can't let it go. If that flaw isn't corrected, the system will fail under Andre." Denise people could, I know what could happen, but what is happening right now to you? What is happening to us?" He didn't have an answer that was good enough. He knew that. He just couldn't make himself stop. The termination meeting lasted 11 minutes. Human resources. A woman named Sandra from legal. A face Andre recognized as the kind that gets hired to handle exits professionally, which meant without drama and without anything that would later become a liability. Meridian is restructuring its design engineering division, the HR representative said. Her name was Janelle, and to her credit, she maintained eye contact throughout, which was more than most people could do in these meetings. "As part of that restructuring, your position is being eliminated." "My position?" "The senior design engineer propulsion systems role, yes." Andre looked at her. He looked at Sandra from legal. He looked at the envelope on the table between them, which he knew contained a severance offer and a non-disclosure agreement. "I submitted a formal report identifying a critical system flaw 8 weeks ago," Andre said. 6 weeks ago, I submitted supplementary documentation. I requested 3 follow-up meetings. I have had one 30-minute meeting in response in which my findings were not addressed on a technical level. Mr. Whitmore, this decision is related to organizational restructuring, not to. I understand what it's related to." He picked up the envelope. He turned it over in his hands once. He put it back down on the table without opening it. "Is there a technical rebuttal to my report anywhere in your files?" he asked. "Has anyone at this company in 8 weeks produced a document that addresses my findings on a technical basis and demonstrates that they are incorrect?" Janelle opened her mouth, closed it. "Because if there isn't," Andre said very quietly, "then this isn't a restructuring, and we both know that." The meeting ended shortly after that. Andre carried a single cardboard box to his truck. Inside it, a framed photo of himself and Denise at MIT graduation, a coffee mug, 2 engineering reference texts, and a small succulent plant his daughter Maya had given him for his birthday. Maya was 4 years old. He sat in his truck for a long time before starting the engine. The marriage did not survive the year. That wasn't the story people expected. The story people expected when they heard parts of what happened to Andre was one where adversity made a family stronger, where a man and his wife pulled together against the thing that tried to break them. That wasn't what happened. What happened was that the loss of the job broke something in the architecture of the marriage that neither of them had known was load-bearing. Denise was not a cruel woman. She was not unsupportive. But she was also someone who had organized her life around a certain picture of the future, and that picture had included a career trajectory and a financial stability that were now gone. She had her own career. She had her own education. She was not dependent on Andre in any material sense. But something shifted anyway, in the way that things shift when 2 people are grieving different losses in the same house. They tried. 18 months of trying. Counseling. Conversations. Silences that were meant to be generous and instead were just silences. In the end, Denise sat down with Andre at the kitchen table and said very simply that she thought they had become two different people who wanted two different things. She wasn't wrong. He could see it too, even as part of him wanted to argue against what his own eyes were telling him. The divorce was quiet, uncomplicated. They were both too exhausted for anything else. The custody arrangement gave Andre primary custody of Maya, who was 5 now, and who understood nothing about what was happening, except that she was living in a new place with her daddy, and that the new place smelled like motor oil, and there was always something interesting being taken apart on the workbench. Maya loved the workbench. She would sit on a stool beside it, swinging her legs, handing Andre tools when he asked for them, and asking a continuous stream of questions that he answered as completely as he would have answered a colleague. Why does the engine make that noise? Because there's a misfire in the 3rd cylinder. The combustion cycle is off. Is it sick? In a way, we're going to fix it. How? I'll show you. He always showed her. It was, he realized, the best part of every day. Not because it was teaching. Not because he was passing something down. Just because Maya's curiosity was completely honest, completely unself-conscious, and it reminded him every single day that the knowledge in his head was real. That the understanding he carried was real. Even when the world outside the garage acted like it wasn't. It was Maya who noticed the notebooks first about 2 years after the move to the garage. She had climbed up on the crate to reach something on the high shelf of the workbench, and she'd found the stack of composition notebooks bundled together with a rubber band, and she'd pulled one down and opened it, and she'd looked at the pages full of equations and diagrams for a long moment before looking at her father. "Daddy, is this your homework?" Andre had looked up from a carburetor rebuild. "Something like that." "Did you finish it?" He had looked at the notebook in her hands. The cover of that particular one he knew was marked with the date September 2016. The month before he'd submitted the report to Meridian. The month he'd spent working through the resonance modeling for the 4th time, making absolutely certain he hadn't made an error. He hadn't made an error. "Not yet," he said. After that, he started opening the notebooks again in the evenings. After Maya was in bed in the quiet of the garage with the overhead light on and the world outside fully dark. He started from where he'd left off because the problem he'd identified at Meridian hadn't been a static thing. It had been a symptom of a broader class of failure modes in how the industry was approaching certain types of structural integration. If the specific system he'd analyzed had that flaw, there was a reasonable probability that related systems built on similar design philosophies carried similar risks. I wasn't working for anyone. There was no contract. There was no publication he was writing toward. There was no institution. He was working because the problem was real, and because not thinking about it had never been an option his brain was willing to accept. He bought 2 new composition notebooks every month at the drugstore down the street. The stack beneath the workbench grew. Dr. Evelyn Carter had expected a lot of things when she was directed to seek out Andre Whitmore. She had not expected the notebooks. She had come to his garage because a contact at a defense contractor, a woman named Patricia Moran, who had submitted a memo years earlier that had gone nowhere, had reached out to Carter privately off the record when Carter was 3 weeks into an investigation she wasn't supposed to be conducting. Carter was investigating the failure patterns in the ARCS-7 system, which was the spacecraft structural integration system that was, as of 6 weeks ago, exhibiting anomalies that the entire NASA Propulsion and Structural Integration Division had classified as under evaluation, bureaucratic language for "we don't know what's wrong and we're scared." ARCS-7 was not a small project. It was the load-bearing architecture for a next-generation orbital platform that had cost $3.2 billion and was scheduled for a crewed operation in 14 months. If the structural integration system was compromised, the platform was compromised. If the platform was compromised, the mission was compromised. If the mission was compromised, 4 astronauts were compromised. Carter hadn't slept a full night in 3 weeks. Patricia Moran's message had been 6 sentences long. She had explained who Andre Whitmore was, what he had found at Meridian, what had happened to him, and why Carter should look at his work before she spent another week going in circles with the internal team. He saw this coming years ago, Moran had written. He was the only one who did. Carter had driven 4 hours to get here. She had expected to find a bitter man, possibly an unstable one, someone who had been ground up by a system and emerged on the other side with an axe to grind and a persecution narrative that had long since replaced the actual technical work. Instead, she walked into a garage where a man was lying under a tractor, and when he rolled out and looked at her, his eyes were steady and completely clear, and she had the immediate disorienting sense that she was standing in front of someone who was much further ahead in a conversation than she was. She showed him the RCS-7 anomaly data. She had planned to walk him through the background, first explain the system architecture, orient him to the problem. He didn't let her. Hai took the data printout. He looked at the vibration frequency readings for about 90 seconds. Then he set that page aside and looked at the thermal differential mapping. He held that one longer. His jaw tightened slightly. He put it down. "Where are the pressure variance logs from the structural junction housings?" Carter stared at him. "Those aren't in what I gave you." "I know they're not in what you gave me. I'm asking where they are because those readings are going to show a specific oscillating variance pattern in the 0.003 to 0.007 Hz range, and that pattern is what's driving everything else you're looking at." The silence lasted 4 seconds. "How do you know that?" Carter said. Andre looked at her steadily. "Because I modeled this exact failure class 9 years ago," he said. "Come here." He walked to the workbench. He moved a socket set. He pulled out a composition notebook with a cracked spine and a date on the cover that read October 2016. He opened it to a page roughly 2/3 of the way through and put it on the workbench in front of her. Carter looked at the page. Then she looked up at Andre. Then she looked back at the page. The diagram on that page, drawn by hand in pencil in a garage, attached to a small repair shop on a cracked asphalt parking lot, described the failure mode she had been staring at on her screens for 3 weeks. To the variable. To the decimal point. To the exact oscillating variance range in the structural junction housings. "Oh my God," she said. "It's not God." Andre said not unkindly. "It's math." She stood outside the garage for 20 minutes on the phone. The 2 colleagues who'd come with her, Brennan Walsh, a structural systems analyst, and Dr. James Okafor, who was technically their liaison to the contractor oversight team, stood nearby without speaking, watching her pace. The call was to her direct superior associate administrator for space operations, Dr. Thomas Vega, who had specifically told her 3 days ago that pursuing outside consultation on the RCS-7 anomaly without going through formal channels was a career-defining decision and not necessarily in a positive way. "Tom," she said when he picked up, "I need you to listen to me without interrupting for 60 seconds. Evelyn." 60 seconds, please. A pause. "Go ahead." "I'm at a garage in Macon County. I'm looking at a handwritten notebook from 2016 that describes the RCS-7 failure mode. Complete. Accurate. Down to the junction housing pressure variance. A man named Andre Whitmore, former Meridian engineer, pushed out after he identified this failure class, and nobody listened, wrote every bit of it. He built the whole failure model in his personal time while he was still employed and submitted it formally. Meridian buried it. He's been sitting on this for 9 years. Silence. "Tom." "I heard you." "The pressure variance range he predicted matches what we're seeing in the RCS-7 data to 3 significant figures. He told me which readings to look at before I told him what system I was investigating." More silence. "Evelyn," Tom Vega said slowly, "you understand what you're saying?" "Yes." "You understand the implications for the Meridian relationship for the contracting oversight process?" "Tom." Her voice was flat and completely steady. "We have 4 people scheduled to operate that platform in 14 months. Do you want to talk about the contracting relationship, or do you want to talk about the platform?" The silence this time was the kind that meant someone was changing their position. "Send me his original report," Vega said. "It's 9 years old. Send it to me. And Evelyn." "Yeah. Tell him we need him." Carter went back inside. Andre was back under the tractor. She could hear the sound of a wrench on metal from the other side of the machine. "Mr. Whitmore." The sound of the wrench stopped. "We'd like to bring you in," she said, formally, "to work with the ARC ES7 team directly." The wrench started again. "I have a tractor to finish. Farmer needs it back by noon." "Mr. Whitmore, I think you understand the scope of what we're talking about." "I understand it fine." The wrench stopped again. He rolled out from under the tractor and stood up and looked at her. "What I don't understand is why you think I should want to help." "Because people's lives. I know whose lives are involved." His voice was even. No anger in it, which somehow made it sharper. "I've known for 9 years whose lives were at risk. I tried to tell people that. I documented it. I went through every process I had access to. I was told I was difficult. I was told I didn't fit the culture. I was handed a box and walked out of a building." Carter held his gaze. "I know," she said. "Do you? Not the way you do. But I know what's in Patricia Moran's memo. I know what happened." Something shifted in his face, barely perceptible, just the slight change of someone recalibrating. "You talked to Patricia. She's the one who sent me here." Andre was quiet for a moment. He walked to the workbench and picked up a rag and wiped his hands methodically, one finger at a time. "The problem in ARC 7, he said without turning around, isn't one component. You understand that? Tell me. It's an interaction effect. 3 subsystems that each function within tolerance individually, but create a resonance cascade when they operate simultaneously under specific load conditions. The standard testing protocols don't simulate those conditions because the conditions were assumed to be edge cases. They're not edge cases. They're predictable operating parameters." He turned around. "Your team has been trying to find the broken part," he said. "There isn't a broken part. The design is the problem." Carter stared at him. "How long would it take you to lay that out formally?" "The complete failure model." Andre looked at the notebooks beneath the workbench. "The model is already built," he said. "Has been for 9 years." He picked up a composition notebook. He handed it to her. "Tell your farmer to call me," he said. "I'll have his tractor done by 10. Maya Whitmore was 8 years old and very good at reading rooms. She could tell the morning that the people from NASA came that something was different. Not bad different. Her father had a specific kind of stillness when things were bad, a quiet that went all the way down, and she knew that quiet well. She'd seen it in the years right after they moved to the garage. She'd learned not to ask too many questions during that quiet. This was different. This was the kind of stillness that happened when her father was working on something hard. When he was thinking through a problem he hadn't solved yet, turning it in his head, looking at it from different angles. He got quiet sometimes in the evenings over the notebooks, and when she'd look over at him, she could see that he wasn't absent. He was intensely fully present, just present inside the problem. She came downstairs at 7:15 to find him at the kitchen table, with 4 notebooks open in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold by his elbow. "The fancy people left?" she asked. "They left." She sat down across from him and looked at the notebooks. "Did they want your help?" "Yes." "Are you going to help them?" He looked up at her. His daughter. 8 years old, hair still messy from sleep, wearing the NASA socks that he'd bought her at the Kennedy Space Center gift shop 2 years ago on a trip he'd saved for 3 months to afford. "I think I am," he said. Maya nodded very seriously. "Good," she said. "Because it's important." "How do you know it's important?" She gave him the look that she'd been perfecting since she was about 5. The look that meant she was 8 years old, not 4, and she understood more than he sometimes remembered. "Because they came to you," she said. "And the important things always come to you." Andre Whitmore looked at his daughter for a long moment. He thought about a 47-page report sitting on a conference table in a building he would never go back to. He thought about a box carried to a truck in a parking lot. He thought about 9 years of evenings in the garage with a flashlight and a notebook and a mind that refused to stop working, refused to be made small, refused to accept that what it knew didn't matter. He thought about Maya, 4 years old, sitting on a crate and handing him a wrench and asking why the engine made that sound. "Because there's a misfire. We're going to fix it. I'll show you." He picked up his cold coffee and finished it. He opened the notebook to the page he needed. He started to work. Outside, the morning light came through the garage door and fell across the workbench and across the tools and across the stack of notebooks that had been waiting 9 years to be read by the right people. The man everyone had called just a scrap mechanic sat down at that workbench. And the most important work of his life began. The drive to NASA's Regional Operations Facility took Dr. Evelyn Carter 3 hours and 40 minutes. Andre sat in the passenger seat of the government SUV with a canvas bag on his lap. Inside it, 4 composition notebooks, a mechanical pencil, and a thermos of coffee he'd made himself before leaving the garage. He hadn't packed anything else. Carter had mentioned that NASA could provide whatever materials he needed. Andre had nodded and packed his own notebooks anyway. Brennan Walsh drove. James Okafor sat in the back and spent most of the drive looking at his phone and not making eye contact with anyone, which Andre understood. Okafor had been quiet since the garage, the particular quiet of a man who had come somewhere expecting one thing and found something that rearranged his assumptions without warning. Carter spent the first 40 minutes of the drive making calls. Her voice was professional and clipped the way people sound when they're managing a situation that keeps growing faster than they can contain it. Andre listened without appearing to listen and understood from her side of the conversations alone that his arrival at the facility was not going to be universally welcomed. He had not expected it to be. When Carter finally put her phone down and turned to look at him, he was already looking out the window. "I want you to know something before we get there," she said. "All right." "There are people on the team who don't know the full context. They know we're bringing in an outside consultant. They don't know who you are or where you came from. Some of them are going to have opinions about that." "I know. I want you to know that I'll handle it." Andre turned from this window and looked at her directly. "Dr. Carter, with respect, I have been in rooms where people had opinions about me since I was 22 years old and showed up to my first engineering internship. I don't need you to handle it. I just need access to the full ARC-7 dataset. Every subsystem reading, every test log, every anomaly flag from the last 18 months. Carter held his gaze for a moment. "You'll have it within an hour of arrival. Then we're fine." She nodded, turned back around. Walsh glanced in the rearview mirror just briefly, and Andre caught the look. Not contempt, not admiration. Something closer to the expression of a man recalibrating in real time. Andre opened his thermos and drank his coffee and watched the highway go by. He had been in worse situations than a room full of skeptical engineers. He had survived a room full of engineers who had already made their decision before he opened his mouth. Skeptical he could work with. The facility was larger than the address had suggested. 3 connected buildings behind a security gate, ID check, visitor badges, the whole process. A young security officer looked at Andre's driver's license and then at the visitor authorization. Carter had filed, and there was one beat, barely a second, where something moved across the officer's face. Then it was gone, and he printed the badge, and Andre clipped it to his shirt and followed Carter through the glass doors. The main engineering floor was exactly what he'd expected. Open plan monitors everywhere. Whiteboards covered in diagrams that he could read from across the room. A cluster of workstations near the center of the space was clearly the RCS-7 nerve center. He could see the system schematics pulled up on 3 large screens, and even from 20 feet away, he could see the anomaly overlay flags that the team had been chasing. He could also see the moment they walked through the door, the exact moment the room registered their arrival. It moved like a wave. Head turns the drop in conversation volume, the specific kind of attention that is not welcoming but assessing. 6 engineers at the central workstations, all of them looking up. A 7th person standing at the main whiteboard, who turned slowly and looked at Andre with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally skeptical. Carter raised her voice slightly to carry across the room. "Team, this is Andre Whitmore. He'll be working with us on the junction housing analysis. Please give him full data access." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the man at the whiteboard put down his marker. His name was Dr. Philip Greer. Andre would learn this in about 90 seconds. Greer was Meridian's embedded systems liaison to the ARCS-7 project, meaning he was the direct representative of the company that had built the system assigned to work alongside NASA's team throughout the review process. He was 51 years old, had a PhD from Caltech, and carried himself with the ease of someone who had never once walked into a professional room and wondered if he belonged there. "Dr. Carter." Greer's voice was measured. "Can I have a word? After we get Mr. Whitmore set up. I think it would be better to have that word now." The room went very still. Carter turned to look at Greer with an expression that Andre recognized, the expression of a woman who had anticipated exactly this moment and had already decided how it was going to go. "Philip," she said pleasantly, "get him access." Greer looked at Andre. Andre looked back at him, and in the 3 seconds of that exchange, Andre understood something clearly. Greer knew who he was. This was not a stranger looking at a stranger. This was a man looking at a name he had heard before, connected to a story he had heard before, and the story he had heard was not the one Carter had read in Patricia Moran's memo. Greer turned to a younger engineer at the nearest workstation, set him up with read-only access to the Level 2 dataset. "Full access," Carter said. She hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. "Every subsystem, every test log, every anomaly report." Greer's jaw tightened slightly, less than most people would notice. Andre noticed. "Evelyn, he's an outside consultant. Protocol requires." "Philip." She stopped. She turned and faced him fully, and her voice dropped to something very quiet and very clear. "I have a signed authorization from Tom Vega's office. Do you want me to get it, or do you want to give him the access?" 10 seconds of silence. Greer looked at Andre one more time, and what was in his face in that moment was not quite anger, and not quite fear, and not quite professional contempt. It was something more complicated than any of those. Something that looked, if Andre was reading it correctly, like recognition. "Full access," Greer said to the engineer. Then he walked to the far end of the room and picked up his phone. The young engineer, her badge said Riley T., looked at Andre with undisguised curiosity. "I can set you up over here," she said, gesturing to a workstation. "It'll take me about 10 minutes to pull everything together." "That's fine." Andre set his canvas bag down and unzipped it, pulling out the first notebook. "While you do that, can you pull up the pressure variance logs from the structural junction housings? Specifically the readings from the last 90 days. Riley looked at him. "Those are the readings nobody can make sense of." "I know. Pull them up." She pulled them up. Andre opened the notebook to a page dated November 2016 and set it on the desk beside the monitor. He looked at the screen. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the screen again. The numbers on the screen and the numbers in the notebook were not identical. They were from different systems, different scales, different years, different missions. But the pattern, the oscillating variance, shaped the frequency signature. The way the anomaly built across time, rather than appearing suddenly, was the same the way a fingerprint is the same. Unmistakably, uncomfortably, definitively the same. Riley was watching him. She had stopped typing. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully. "Andre. Andre. That notebook." She pointed at it without touching it, the way you point at something you're not sure you should disturb. When is that from?" 2016. She looked at the date written on the cover. She looked at the screen. She looked at the date again. "That's 9 years ago." "Yes." "And that pattern is the same pattern?" "Yes." Riley sat back in her chair. She was young, late 20s, maybe the kind of engineer who had gotten to this facility on raw ability, and who still had the habit of letting her face show exactly what she was thinking, because she hadn't yet learned to hide it. What her face showed right now was something that looked like the ground shifting under her feet. "How is that possible?" she said, and she wasn't asking it professionally. She was asking it the way people ask things, when the answer is going to require them to rethink something they thought was settled. "Because the failure class isn't specific to ARCS-7, Andre said. It's a systemic design philosophy problem. The resonance management approach that Meridian used on this system came from a framework they developed in 2014. I identified the vulnerability in that framework in 2015 and formally documented it in 2016. The question was never whether a system built on that framework would show this failure mode. The question was always which system and when. Riley stared at him. You knew which system it would be. No. I knew the class of system it would be. High-load structural integration, multi-subsystem, simultaneous operation, specific thermal and pressure cycling parameters. RCS-7 fits that profile exactly. He turned back to the screen. Now, show me the junction housing readings from the day the anomaly was first flagged, and the 3 days before it. Riley pulled it up without another word. They worked for 2 hours before anyone interrupted them. Greer came back. He brought another man with him, older, heavier, with the particular confidence of someone whose title was large. Andre didn't know him yet. He would learn later that the man's name was Warren Holt, and that Holt was Meridian's vice president of systems engineering, and that he had driven to this facility within 90 minutes of receiving a phone call from Philip Greer. The two of them stopped at the edge of the workstation. Mr. Whitmore, Holt said. His voice was smooth in the way that expensive cars are smooth, the roughness engineered out of it. I understand you've been given access to our system's data. Andre did not look up from the screen. I'm working Mr. Holt, Warren Holt, Meridian. Now Andre looked up. He took his time doing it. He met Holt's eyes and held them, and he felt something move through him. Not anger, which was what people always expected, but something colder and more precise. Recognition. The face was different. The name was different. The room was different. But the posture was identical to a posture he had stood in front of 9 years ago, across a conference table in a building he'd been walked out of with a cardboard box. I know who Meridian is, Andre said. Holt smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that was designed to communicate reasonableness. Then you understand why I want to make sure we're following the right protocols here. You're an outside contractor with access to proprietary systems data. He has full authorization, Carter said. She had appeared somehow without Andre noticing her move. She was standing 3 feet to his right. From the Associate Administrator's office. I understand that, Evelyn. I'm just raising the question of whether it's appropriate to have someone without current professional standing in aerospace. Reviewing sensitive structural data on a crewed mission system. The room had gone quiet again. Not the busy quiet of people focused on work. The specific quiet of people who have stopped pretending to work because they don't want to miss what's happening. Andre set down his pencil. He turned in his chair and faced Holt fully. Mr. Holt. His voice was completely even. On October 14, 2016, I submitted a 47-page technical report to Meridian's senior engineering leadership. That report identified a resonance cascade vulnerability in the structural integration framework that your company used to build, RCS-7. It included full mathematical modeling failure probability analysis and a recommended design modification that would have prevented this failure mode. Holt's smile had not moved, but something behind it had. I'm not familiar with that report. No, you wouldn't be. Because it was never formally entered into Meridian's technical review system. Because the two people who received it decided it was easier to question my qualifications than to address my findings. Because 6 weeks after I submitted it, I was informed that my position was being eliminated as part of a restructuring. Mr. Whitmore, personnel decisions at Meridian are not what I'm talking about. Andre stood up. He was not a physically imposing man, but there was something about the way he stood up, the complete unhurried deliberateness of it, that made the space around him change. I'm talking about a documented failure that your company was warned about 9 years ago by a qualified engineer through appropriate channels and chose to ignore. And I'm talking about the fact that your systems data, which I have been looking at for the last 2 hours, with Dr. Carter's full authorization, confirms every finding in that report. He picked up the notebook from the desk and held it out toward Holt. This is from 2016, he said. Do you want to look at it? Holt did not take the notebook. I think, Holt said carefully, that this is a conversation that needs to happen with legal counsel present. Then get your counsel, Carter said. Her voice was arctic. And while you're doing that, Mr. Whitmore is going to keep working, because we have 4 people scheduled to write a platform built on your framework in 14 months. And right now, he's the only person in this room who fully understands what's wrong with it. Holt looked at her. He looked at Andre. He looked at the room of engineers who had stopped pretending not to watch. He took out his phone and left the floor without another word. Greer lingered for a moment longer. I was looking at the notebook still in Andre's hand, still extended slightly, the offer of it still hanging in the air. His face was doing something complicated. Andre watched it happen and didn't rush it. You were at Meridian, Greer said. Not a question. Yes. You submitted a report. Yes. I never saw it. Andre looked at him for a long moment. I know you didn't, he said. That's the point. Greer held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked toward the far end of the room, and Andre watched him go, and then he sat back down and turned to the screen and picked up his pencil. Riley was looking at him. You okay? She asked. I'm fine. He uncapped the pencil. Pull up the thermal differential data from the junction housings. I want to look at the correlation between the thermal cycling pattern and the oscillation frequency. She pulled it up. They went back to work. By 4 in the afternoon, Andre had filled 11 pages of a new notebook and had drawn a complete failure model on the whiteboard that had been erased and reused so many times the surface was gray. Riley had stopped doing anything else 2 hours ago and was entirely focused on pulling data as fast as he could analyze it, feeding readings into a verification model he'd designed in the margin of his 3rd notebook page. 2 other engineers had drifted over. They hadn't asked permission. They had just moved their chairs until they were close enough to see what was on the whiteboard and the screen, and then they had stayed, and after a while they had started asking questions. Not challenging questions. The kind that meant they were following and wanted to follow further. Their names, Andre learned, were Daniela Reyes and Marcus Webb. Daniela was a thermal system specialist who had been flagging the thermal differential anomalies in the RCS-7 data for 6 weeks without being able to explain what was generating them. Marcus was a structural analyst who had been chasing the junction housing pressure variance and had been convinced until approximately 2 hours ago that it was a sensor calibration error. It's not a sensor error, Marcus said, staring at the whiteboard. He said it like a man watching a thing he'd built collapse cleanly and neatly and couldn't look away. It was never a sensor error. No, Andre said. The variance is real. It's real, it's predictable. And it's going to get worse in a specific way under specific conditions, which is what makes it dangerous, because it's going to look manageable right up until it isn't. Daniela leaned forward, elbows on her knees. The thermal correlation you drew between the cycling frequency and the resonance cascade initiation point. How did you derive that? The interaction between the thermal expansion rate of the junction housing material and the pressure load timing. When the 2 systems cycle at the same frequency, even briefly, the resonance effect is amplified. It doesn't have to happen for long. It just has to happen at the wrong moment. What's the wrong moment? Andre looked at her. Max structural load, which in an orbital platform operating cycle is re-entry transition, Daniela said. Her face had gone very still. Oh God. Yes. The word fell into the room like something heavy dropped from a height, and everyone within earshot felt the weight of it. Marcus stood up and walked to the whiteboard and stood in front of it for a long time without speaking, looking at the failure model Andre had drawn. He put his hand up once like he was going to point at something and then put it down again. 9 years, he said half to himself. Andre didn't respond. This was sitting out there for 9 years, and nobody. Marcus stopped, started again. How did nobody? Because nobody was looking for it, Andre said. Because the people who should have been looking were told not to look. And because when someone looked anyway, it was more convenient to question who was looking than to look at what they'd found. The room was quiet. Carter was standing at the back of the space. She had been there for the last hour, positioned at the edge of the group, and Andre had been aware of her without acknowledging her. Now he looked at her directly, and she met his eyes, and what passed between them didn't need words. She had understood when she walked into his garage that morning that she was going to bring something important back with her. She had not fully understood what it was going to cost to get it into the room. She did now. One of the engineers Andre hadn't spoken to yet, a man who had been sitting 3 workstations away and quietly reviewing data. Throughout the afternoon, stood up and walked over with a printout in his hand. He was young. Younger than Riley even. He looked like he had been doing math in his head for the last hour and had just finished. "Mr. Whitmore," he said. He was holding the printout carefully like it mattered. "I ran the failure timeline based on your cascade model. Current operating parameters, projected load cycles over the next 14 months. He put the printout on the desk. Andre looked at it. The number at the bottom of the page, the probability figure for cascade initiation, before the crude operational date, was not a number anyone in that room wanted to see. Andre looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up the printout and walked to where Carter was standing and put it in her hands. She looked at it. The color shifted in her face by a shade. "Tom needs to see this tonight," Andre said. "Yes. And your team needs the full modification specifications. The corrective design changes, not patches. Actual structural corrections." He paused. "I have the framework for those in the notebooks. It'll take me 2 or 3 days to develop them fully for ARC 7's specific configuration." Carter looked up from the printout. 2 or 3 days. Working straight through, yes. She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had driven 4 hours in a government vehicle with a canvas bag and a thermos of coffee, who had walked into a room full of people who questioned his right to be there, who had sat down at a workstation and opened a 9-year-old notebook and started working without asking for validation from a single person in the building. "What do you need?" she asked. "A desk, full data access, more coffee." He looked back toward the workstation where Riley and Daniela and Marcus and the young engineer with the printout were all still gathered around the whiteboard, looking at the failure model. "And those 4, they're good." Carter followed his gaze. "Riley's been on RCS-7 longer than anyone except Greer," she said. "Daniela's been trying to crack the thermal anomaly for 2 months. Marcus caught the pressure variance before anyone else flagged it. I know. They were the ones asking the right questions. They just needed the framework to understand what the questions were pointing at." He walked back toward the workstation. Riley looked up at him. "What do you need us to do?" "I need the full test log history. Everything from initial system integration forward. And I need someone to cross-reference the anomaly flag dates against the thermal cycling records." "I can do the cross-reference," the young engineer with the printout said. He'd followed Andre back to the workstation, still holding the timeline printout. His name badge said Torres E. "Good." Andre looked at him. "What's your specialty?" "Structural load dynamics." Andre looked at him for one more second, with the expression of a man confirming something he already suspected. "Then you already know what you're going to find when you run that cross-reference," Andre said. Torres looked at the printout in his hand. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I do." They worked through the night. Carter brought food at 8 o'clock, sandwiches from somewhere, coffee things that could be eaten one-handed without sitting down. Most of the food went cold on a side table. Nobody stopped long enough to eat properly, which was fine. There was a particular energy in the room by then that Andre recognized from the best stretches of his career at Meridian, before everything went wrong. The energy of a group of minds locked onto a real problem, moving together without anyone needing to direct it. Each person's work, feeding into the next person's work, like a system that had found its operating frequency. Greer came back once around 9. He stood at the edge of the room and watched for several minutes. He didn't say anything to Andre, and Andre didn't say anything to him. But before Greer left, he stopped at Riley's workstation and looked at the cross-reference data she'd compiled, and Andre saw Greer's hand go to the back of his neck, the gesture of a man processing something that hurts. Andre noted it. He filed it away. He kept working. At 11:30 at night, Carter took a phone call in the corridor and came back with an expression that meant the conversation with Tom Vega had gone further than she'd expected. She pulled Andre aside away from the workstations. "Tom is briefing the administrator tomorrow morning," she said. "This is going up the chain faster than I anticipated." "That's fine. There's going to be a pressure. On the timeline, on the solution, on..." She stopped. started again more carefully. On you, on how you're positioned in this. There are people above Tom who are going to want to understand why an outside person with no current institutional affiliation is driving the primary technical response on a $3 billion crewed mission system. Andre looked at her steadily. There always are, he said. Andre, I'm trying to prepare you. I know. He looked back toward the workstations where Riley and Torres were still working, heads down, the whiteboard behind them now covered edge to edge with calculations. Dr. Carter, I spent 9 years preparing. I prepared when I filed the first report. I prepared when I filed the follow-up. I prepared every night in that garage after my daughter went to sleep with a flashlight and a notebook, staying current in a field that had decided it didn't need me. He paused. I'm not afraid of people who need to understand why I'm in the room. Let them ask. I have been answering that question my entire career. Carter looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. Okay. He turned back toward this workstation. He picked up his pencil. He found the page in the notebook where he'd left off. Outside the night was full dark, and the facility hummed with its own particular machinery. And inside, under fluorescent light, 5 people worked on the problem that one of them had been carrying alone for 9 years. The notebooks were open on the desk. The numbers were right. They had always been right. The briefing with NASA Administrator Leonard Bryce happened at 9 in the morning, and Andre was not supposed to be in the room. That had been made clear the night before in a series of emails that Carter had let Andre read over her shoulder at 2 in the morning, because she believed he had a right to know what was being said about him by people who had never met him. The emails came from 2 directions simultaneously: from Meridian's legal team, who had filed a formal objection to Andre's access authorization within 4 hours of Warren Holt leaving the facility floor, and from a senior advisor in the administrator's office, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had written in careful bureaucratic language that the optics of centering an outside consultant with no current professional standing as the primary technical voice on a crewed mission anomaly review could create complications for the agency's credibility. Optics. That was the word he used. Andre read that email twice. Then he handed the laptop back to Carter without a word and went back to the whiteboard. Carter showed up at Bryce's briefing anyway. She brought a printed copy of Andre's failure model, a copy of the 2016 report, with the original Meridian submission timestamp, still visible in the document metadata, and the probability timeline that Torres had refined overnight into something so precise and so alarming that even Gerald Pruitt had stopped talking about optics by the time he saw it. Andre heard about the briefing from Riley, who heard about it from Torres, who had a friend in the administrative wing. The details came back in fragments over the course of the morning, assembling themselves into a picture as Andre worked. Bryce had asked 3 questions. First was, the failure model technically sound? Carter had answered yes, and she'd brought Daniela and Torres to confirm it independently. Second, was the timeline accurate? Yes, confirmed by 3 separate analyses run overnight. Third, was there anyone else on the planet who understood this failure class as completely as Andre Whitmore? Carter had answered that one herself. No. The authorization for full project integration came through at 11:14 in the morning, signed by Bryce's office directly. It was not a consultation agreement. It was a formal technical partnership designation, which was a category that did not normally exist in NASA's contractor framework, and had to be created specifically for this situation by someone in the legal division who sounded, according to Carter, like they had not slept recently either. She handed Andre the paperwork in the corridor outside the engineering floor. He looked at it. He read the title. He read the scope of authorization. He folded it neatly and put it in his canvas bag next to the notebooks. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me." Carter's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that had been building since the day before and hadn't yet found its way to the surface. "I just made sure the right person was in the right room. You did everything else. Patricia Moran put me in the right room. You drove 4 hours to find me." Carter almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to her face, but it was close. "Let's go fix your spacecraft," she said. He walked back through the door. The engineering floor had changed overnight in the way that spaces change when something important happens in them. The same monitors, the same workstations, the same gray whiteboard, now covered entirely in Andre's handwriting. But the people in it were different. Not different people, but the same people in a different register. There was a density to the attention in the room that hadn't been there the day before. More people had arrived. Word had moved through the facility the way important things move, the way water moves through a building when the pressure changes. Andre counted 14 engineers at the workstations now, up from 6 the evening before. Some of them he recognized. Most he didn't. All of them looked at him when he walked in, and the quality of that attention was different from the assessment and contempt he'd walked into yesterday morning. It wasn't reverence. These were scientists and engineers, and they didn't do reverence easily, which Andre respected. It was something more useful. Focus. The particular focused attention of people who have a problem they cannot solve, and have just been given a reason to believe it might be solvable. He went directly to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. "All right," he said to the room. Not loudly. He didn't need volume. "We're going to work the solution in 3 tracks simultaneously. Junction housing, structural modification resonance, dampening protocol, redesign and operational parameter adjustment to buy time on the existing configuration while the physical modifications are implemented. I need to know who is best positioned for each track." Nobody hesitated for very long. Daniela took thermal and resonance. Marcus took structural modification. Torres organized a 4-person subgroup for operational parameters. Riley stayed at the primary data integration station because she was, as Andre had recognized from the first hour, the person in the room who could hold the most information in her head simultaneously without losing the thread of any of it. It was, Andre thought, but didn't say, the way it should have worked at Meridian 9 years ago. Minds matched to problems work organized around the actual structure of the challenge, rather than around institutional hierarchy and contractual authority. He had tried to build this once before, in a building he no longer had access to, and the attempt had cost him everything he'd had at the time. He was not going to waste the second chance being sentimental about the first one. The morning passed in the way that intense work passes, not quickly, but without friction, each hour absorbed into the next. The 3 tracks moved in parallel and intersected at the points where they had to, and Andre moved between them, spending 20 minutes with Daniela's team, 40, with Marcus looping back to Riley to verify data as new analysis came in. He wrote equations on the whiteboard and then erased sections and rewrote them when the numbers from the data stream changed his assumptions. He asked questions more than he gave answers because the answers were in the room, they were in the minds of these 14 engineers who had been locked on this problem from different angles without a framework to connect them. I gave them the framework. Everything else they built themselves. Philip Greer watched from a distance for most of the morning. He had a workstation at the far end of the floor, and he was doing his own work on it. Andre assumed he was on calls with Meridian, reporting what he was seeing, managing whatever the legal team was constructing, in response to the authorization Bryce had signed. But several times during the morning, Andre looked up and found Greer watching the whiteboard with an expression that had moved somewhere different from where it had been the day before. The contempt was gone. What had replaced it was harder to name. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Greer stood up from his workstation and walked across the floor and stopped behind Marcus's workstation where the structural modification track was running. He stood there for a while without speaking, looking at the screen. Then he pointed at something in the load-bearing analysis. "The stress distribution at the modified junction housing interface," he said quietly to Marcus. "You're using the original material yield specifications." Marcus looked at the screen. "That's what's in the RCS-7 build documentation. The documentation is from 2019. The alloy specification was updated in 2021. The actual yield tolerance is 11% higher than what's in your model." Marcus stared at him. "If that's right, the safety margin on the modification design is actually wider than you're calculating." "Yes." Marcus turned fully in his chair to look at Greer. Greer was not looking at Marcus. He was looking at the screen. "The 2021 spec update is in the procurement records," Greer said. "Not the engineering documentation. If you don't know to look for it, you don't find it." He paused. "I'll get you the file." He walked back to his workstation. Marcus stared at the back of his head for a moment, then turned to the screen, then pulled up his calculation model and stared at that. Then he picked up his phone and called across the room to Andre. Andre, Greer just handed us an 11% wider safety margin on the structural modification. Andre looked up from Daniela's thermal analysis. He looked at the back of Greer's head. Greer was on his phone now, turned slightly away, speaking quietly. Andre watched him for 3 seconds. I went back to Daniela's analysis. Update the model, he said to Marcus. The moment he had been waiting for, the moment he'd known was coming, because it always came in every room he'd ever been in every confrontation he'd ever navigated, arrived at 3:15 in the afternoon, in the form of Warren Holt. Holt came back with 2 people Andre hadn't seen before. A woman who introduced herself as Janet Sue from Meridian's legal division, and a man who did not introduce himself at all, and who had the particular quality of someone used to being in rooms without explaining why. Holt himself had changed into a different suit since yesterday, which meant he'd gone home and come back, or had a change of clothes somewhere, which meant he'd expected to be here for a while. They stopped in the middle of the floor, and the engineering work around them slowed without stopping, like water moving around a stone. Holt looked across the room at Andre. Mr. Whitmore. His voice carried across the floor without effort. I'd like a conversation. I'm in the middle of something. This will take 10 minutes. Andre capped his marker. He handed it to Riley without looking at her. He walked across the floor toward the 3 of them, and as he did, he was aware of the room, aware of the 14 engineers, aware of Carter positioning herself near the door, aware of Greer at his workstation, who had gone very still. He stopped a comfortable distance from Holt and waited. Holt glanced at Sue, who opened a portfolio and removed a single sheet of paper and held it facing Andre. This is a formal notification, Holt said, that Meridian Aerospace Systems is initiating a review of the circumstances surrounding your 2016 separation from the company. We believe there may have been irregularities in the documentation of that departure that affect the legal validity of certain agreements. Andre looked at the paper. He looked at it carefully, the way he looked at any document, with full attention and without the expression that people wanted to provoke. What agreements, he said. The standard separation and confidentiality terms. I never signed a confidentiality agreement. I was handed an envelope containing one. I put it back on the table and left. Sue's composure shifted almost imperceptibly. There may be a dispute about. There is no dispute. I didn't sign it. Your company has a record of what was signed in that meeting because your HR representative and your legal counsel were both present and both witnessed that I left the document on the table. If Meridian has a different account of that meeting, I have 9 years of documentation of my own, beginning with the day I submitted my original report. Mr. Whitmore. Holt's practiced smoothness was showing its understructure now, the way expensive finishes show their underlayer when the heat gets high enough. What we're trying to avoid here is a situation. Andre's voice hadn't changed register once. The situation where your company ignored a safety report. The situation where that decision is now visible to every engineer in this room and to the NASA administrator. That situation. The situation where this becomes a public. I'm not interested in public, Andre said. I never was. If I wanted public, I had 9 years to make this public. I didn't. I went to my garage and I fixed machines and I raised my daughter and I kept working because the problem was still real, whether anyone was paying attention to it or not. He looked at Holt directly, and his voice dropped to something that was very quiet, and in the quiet very clear. I'm not here to hurt Meridian. I'm here because 4 people are going to get on that platform in 14 months, and someone needs to make sure they come back. That is the only reason I am in this building. When the work is done, I will go back to my garage, and I would like very much for you to get out of my way so I can finish it. The silence in the room had a texture to it. The unnamed man who had come in with Holt and Sue and had said nothing since he arrived was looking at Andre with an expression that was almost, if you read it carefully, like approval. He touched Holt's elbow once, just once, barely a contact, and Holt's posture shifted. Sue closed the portfolio. We'll be in touch, Holt said. I'll be here, Andre said. They left. Andre turned and walked back to the whiteboard and picked up the marker that Riley held out to him and uncapped it and found his place in the equation he'd been building. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Torres from across the room. For the record, I want to point out that I've been in this building for 6 years, and I have never once seen anyone make Warren Holt leave a floor by just talking. A sound moved through the room. Not quite laughter. Something lighter than laughter, and heavier at the same time. Andre kept writing. "Get back to work," he said. But there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before, not warmth exactly, but its structure. The thing that warmth is built on. The afternoon gave way to evening, and the evening stretched into night, and the work did not stop. Andre called Maya at 6 o'clock from a quiet corner of the corridor, pressing the phone against his ear and listening to her voice with the particular intensity of a man whose daughter is the load-bearing structure of his entire life. "Are you coming home tomorrow?" "I don't know yet, baby. Maybe the day after." "Is it important?" "Yes." A pause on her end. He could hear the television in the background, her aunt's house where she was staying, because her aunt lived 20 minutes from the garage and was the person Andre trusted most in the world, with the thing he loved most in the world. "Daddy." "Yeah." "Are they being nice to you?" He leaned against the corridor wall and looked at the ceiling. "Some of them," he said. "Which ones?" "The ones who care about the work." Another pause. "Those are the ones that matter," Maya said with the complete certainty of an 8-year-old who has absorbed the architecture of her father's values without knowing she was absorbing anything. "You're right," he said. "They are." "Okay. Love you." "Love you too." He stood in the corridor for a moment after the call ended, holding the phone and not moving. Then he put it in his pocket and went back inside. Greer was at the whiteboard when he returned. This was new. Greer was standing at the whiteboard with a marker in his hand, and he had added something to the lower section of the thermal resonance analysis, a notational modification to the dampening coefficient that Andre had roughed in that morning. It was precise. It was correct. It improved the model. Andre stood in the doorway and looked at it. Greer turned and saw him. He didn't apologize for adding to the whiteboard. He didn't explain himself. He just held the marker and waited. "The dampening coefficient correction," Andre said. "That's based on the 2021 spec update. The material behavior under thermal cycling changed with the alloy update. The original coefficient was underestimating the response rate." Andre walked to the whiteboard. He looked at Greer's addition for a long moment, running the implication forward in his head through 4 steps. "If the response rate is higher, the dampening protocol needs to be recalibrated," Andre said. "The timing window we've been working with is off. By about 8%. 8% in which direction? Favorable. The system is actually more responsive to the correction than your baseline assumed." Andre looked at the modified equation. He looked at Greer. Greer was a man who knew things. That had been clear from the beginning. He was also a man who had spent 2 days in a position that required him to suppress what he knew in service of something that was not the work. And that was a particular kind of misery that Andre understood from the inside. "You've known about this vulnerability," Andre said, not accusing, just stating. Greer didn't answer immediately. "I knew there was something in the resonance behavior that didn't satisfy me," he said finally. "I flagged it twice internally. I was told it was within acceptable parameters." "But you weren't satisfied?" "No." Greer's voice was flat. "I wasn't." "Why didn't you push harder?" Greer looked at the whiteboard. "Because I'm good at knowing when a door is closed," he said. "I've always been good at that. At reading the room and adjusting. At knowing which fights I could win and which ones would cost me more than I could afford to spend." He stopped. "You're not good at that," he said to Andre. "No." Andre agreed. "I'm not." "You kept pushing anyway." "Someone had to." Greer was quiet for a long moment. "They should have listened to you," he said. "In 2016, they should have listened." It was not an apology. It was something smaller and more precise than an apology. An acknowledgement spoken by someone who understood exactly what it was worth and what it cost to say it. Andre heard it for what it was. "Help me fix the timing window," Andre said. Greer picked up his marker. They stood at the whiteboard together for the next 2 hours, and the engineers around them worked from the results, and nobody in the room made a comment about what they were watching, because sometimes a thing is too significant for commentary, and this was one of those times. At 10 minutes past midnight, Daniela stood up from her workstation and said, "I have it." The room went still. She turned her monitor to face the open floor. "The complete resonance dampening protocol," she said. "Cross-verified against the thermal modeling, the structural modification parameters, the updated material specs, and the operational adjustment timeline." She looked at Andre. "It works. The cascade is preventable. If we implement the full modification sequence in the correct order, RPS-7 can be brought to full safety margins within 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The number moved through the room. Torres ran the calculation on his end. He looked up. 6 weeks clears the crude operation schedule with 8 months to spare, he said. Riley was already pulling up the modification implementation schematic, her hands moving fast, building the visualization before anyone had to ask for it. Marcus leaned back in his chair and put his hands over his face and said nothing for 10 seconds. Then he dropped his hands and looked at the ceiling and exhaled slowly, the way people exhale when something they've been carrying for a long time has been put down. Carter was standing near the door. She had her phone in her hand, and she was looking at the screen on Daniela's monitor, and her jaw was tight, and her eyes were bright. She looked at Andre. He was standing at the whiteboard, marker in hand, and he was looking at the solution that 14 engineers and 3 days of work had assembled from the framework that had lived in his notebooks for 9 years. The solution that was always there, that had always been findable, that had never been a mystery, only a thing that nobody with the authority to use it had been willing to see. He felt something move through him that was too complicated for a single name. Satisfaction was part of it. Exhaustion was part of it. A grief that had nothing to do with the present moment and everything to do with what the present moment cost. 9 years of cost. A career dismantled. A marriage lost. A daughter grown 3 years older in a garage on cracked asphalt, while the knowledge that could have been building something sat in composition notebooks under a workbench. He felt all of that, and then he put the cap on the marker. "Write it up," he said to Daniela. "Full technical specification, implementation sequence, verification protocol, everything." "How soon?" "Start now. We brief Bryce's office at 7. He walked to the side table and picked up a sandwich that had gone cold 3 hours ago, and ate half of it standing up, looking at the whiteboard, thinking about the 6 weeks ahead, and the 8 months after that, and the 4 people who would climb aboard a platform that was going to hold them now, because the thing that had been wrong with it had finally been found by the right people in the right room. His phone buzzed. A text from Maya's aunt. "She made me read her engineering magazines before bed. Both of them. I hope you're okay." He put the phone back in his pocket. He picked up the other half of the sandwich. He went back to work. The 7 o'clock briefing with Administrator Bryce ran for 2 hours and 19 minutes, which was, according to Carter, approximately 2 hours longer than Bryce's standard briefings ran. Andre sat at the conference table and walked through the complete failure model, the solution architecture, and the implementation sequence without notes, because the notes were in his head and had been for 9 years. Bryce asked good questions. Andre had expected competence from the man. You didn't run an agency like this without it. But the quality of Bryce's questions was something beyond competence. He followed the technical reasoning at full depth, pushed back at the exact points where a reasonable skeptic should push back. And when Andre answered those pushbacks, Bryce sat with the answers for a real moment before moving to the next question. There were 8 other people in the room. 3 from Bryce's senior staff, 2 from the Contracting Oversight Division, a woman from the Office of Safety and Mission Assurance, who had arrived with a thick folder and left with 4 empty notebook pages of new observations, and Gerald Pruitt, who had written the email about optics and who sat at the far end of the table and said very little and wrote a great deal. Warren Holt was not in the room. Meridian's legal challenge to Andre's authorization had been addressed somewhere above Holt's level in a conversation Andre was not part of and did not need to be part of. Carter had told him only that it had been addressed and that Bryce's office had been direct about the agency's position. Andre had nodded and not asked for details. He didn't need the details. He needed the room, and he had the room. At the 2-hour mark, Bryce leaned forward and put both hands flat on the table. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to ask you something directly." "All right." "The modification sequence your team has developed the full implementation 6-week timeline. How confident are you?" Andre looked at him. "In the technical solution, completely. In the implementation timeline, 94% accounting for variables in the physical modification process that I can model but can't fully control until we're working on the actual hardware. And the remaining 6%, contingencies that your engineering team is fully equipped to handle if they arise. I'll document them in the implementation specification." Bryce studied him for a moment, the way that people study things they want to understand fully before they commit to them. "Why 94?" Bryce asked. "Not 95, not 90. "Because 95 would be rounding up and 90 would be rounding down," Andre said. "And I don't round." Something moved across Bryce's face that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. "No," Bryce said. "I don't imagine you do." He straightened in his chair and looked around the table. "We move forward with the full implementation," he said. "Mr. Whitmore leads the technical oversight. Carter manages the operational integration. I want daily status reports on my desk, and I want the safety verification protocol running in parallel from day one." He stopped. "And I want a formal review initiated into how a documented safety report submitted through appropriate channels in 2016 failed to receive a technical response. Not a legal review, a process review. I want to know how this happened so we can make sure it doesn't happen again." Pruitt looked up from his notepad. "Leonard, the contracting relationship with Meridian. Gerald." Bryce's voice was patient and completely final. "4 people are going to ride that platform. That is the relationship I'm concerned with." Pruitt looked back down at his notepad. The briefing ended. Andre walked out of the conference room and into the corridor and stood very still for a moment with his canvas bag over one shoulder and his hand on the strap, and felt the full weight of what had just happened settle into him. Not the professional validation that was real, but it was not the thing that weighed. What weighed was the simpler thing underneath it: he had been right. He had always been right. And for 3 days in this building with these people, that rightness had finally been allowed to do what it was always supposed to do. Carter came out of the conference room behind him. "You should call your daughter," she said. He looked at her. "It's 7:30 in the morning. She's 8. She's been up for an hour already, I guarantee it." He almost laughed. It came close. Closer than anything had come in 3 days. He called Maya from the corridor, while Carter managed the cascade of communications that the briefing had just initiated. Maya answered on the second ring, and she was indeed already up, and she already knew from her aunt that something significant had happened, because apparently her aunt had been monitoring news alerts on her phone all morning, though Andre could not figure out how anything was in the news yet. "Daddy, it's on the internet." "What's on the internet?" There's a thing about a NASA engineer in a garage." Andre closed his eyes. "It's just starting," he said. "Is it bad?" He thought about it honestly, the way he always answered Maya's questions honestly. "No," he said. "It's just going to be a lot." "Can you handle a lot?" "I've been handling a lot since before you were born." "Okay." Her voice was satisfied the way it got when she'd confirmed something she already believed. "When are you coming home?" "Soon. I have work to do here first." "Okay." A pause. "Daddy." "Yeah." "I told Mrs. Patterson at school that you were helping NASA. She said that was very nice. I think she thought I was making it up." "Let her think that," Andre said. "It doesn't matter." "I know," Maya said. "You always say the work is the thing that matters." "It is." "Okay. I love you." "I love you too." He put the phone away and went back to work. The 6 weeks of implementation that followed were the most intense, sustained technical work Andre had done since his peak years at Meridian, and they were completely different from those years in every way that mattered. At Meridian, he had worked in the constant awareness of a ceiling. the knowledge that his ideas had to be filtered through a layer of institutional approval that was not always responsive to the ideas themselves. Here, for the first time in 9 years, the ceiling was gone. The work was the ceiling. The problem was the only authority in the room. The modification team grew to 22 people across 3 facilities. Andre moved between them according to where the critical path needed him, which meant that some days he was at the primary integration facility working directly on the junction housing modifications with Marcus's structural team, and other days he was 3 time zones away on a video call at 2 in the morning, walking a fabrication team through a tolerance specification that could not be misunderstood. He slept when he could. He ate what was available. He called Maya every evening without fail, even when the call was only 4 minutes long, and consisted almost entirely of him listening to her describe her day, while he sat in a rental car in a parking lot somewhere, and let the sound of her voice remind him what all of it was for. The implementation moved at a pace that surprised even Andre, which meant it surprised everyone else considerably more. Riley coordinated the data integration across all 3 facilities, with an efficiency that made Andre, who had spent 9 years surrounded only by broken farm equipment and his own notebooks, realize how much he had missed working alongside people who were genuinely excellent at what they did. Torres ran the structural verification protocol so tightly that the safety and mission assurance team, who had initially assigned a 6-person audit group to review his work, reduced it to 2 people by week 3, because Torres was catching his own errors before they did. Daniela's resonance dampening protocol, when they applied it to the actual hardware, performed within 0.3% of the predicted response. She called Andre from the facility floor when they got the first confirmation reading, and he was in a different state at the time, and she said only 3 words before her voice broke. "It's working, Andre." He stood in the middle of a hotel corridor and pressed the phone against his ear and said nothing for a moment. "I know," he said. "It's actually working." "I know." He heard her breathing on the other end, and he understood what was in it because he felt the same thing. Not triumph, which was too simple, but something that included grief alongside the relief. The grief of how long it had taken. The grief of what the delay had cost. The relief of knowing that from this point forward, the cost stopped accumulating. "Get some sleep," he told her. "We have 3 more weeks." Philip Greer was present throughout the implementation in a way that had not been formally arranged, but it had simply happened. The way things happen when a person makes a decision about who they want to be in a specific moment and then acts on it consistently. He had provided Meridian's internal material specifications, the undocumented testing protocol variations, 3 years of proprietary data on the system's actual operational behavior that would have taken Andre's team months to reconstruct from observation. He provided all of it. Not through Meridian's legal team. Directly. In person. Sitting down at workstations and pulling up files and saying quietly, "Here is what I know." Andre had not thanked him for this, not in the explicit way. What he did instead was include Greer's name in the formal technical record, wherever Greer's knowledge had contributed to the solution, which was the only form of acknowledgement that would outlast the moment. Greer noticed. He didn't comment on it. But Andre saw the way his posture changed when he saw his name in the documentation. A subtle shift in how he held himself in a room, like something had been returned to him that he hadn't known was missing. The morning of the final verification test, there were 31 people in the primary integration facility, and nobody had slept properly in 48 hours, and the coffee machine in the break room had been running continuously for so long that the carafe had a permanent brown stain. Andre stood at the monitoring station with Carter on his left and Daniela on his right, and watched the readings come in as the RCS-7 system ran its full operational cycle simulation for the first time since the modifications had been implemented. The room was very quiet. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of 31 people holding their breath in the same direction. The simulation ran through the standard operational parameters. The junction housing pressure variance held within the new tolerance band. The thermal differential stayed inside the modified cycling protocol. And then the simulation reached the re-entry transition load conditions, the point in the operational cycle where the original design would have initiated the resonance cascade, where the three subsystems would have found each other's frequency and begun the amplification sequence that ended only one way. Andre watched the numbers. The numbers held. He watched them hold through 10 seconds of maximum structural load, and then 20, and then the simulation completed the transition, and the readings stabilized. Inside every margin they had, designed them to stabilize inside. And the room stayed quiet for 3 more seconds after the simulation ended, before someone Andre never knew who started clapping. And then the whole room was clapping, and Carter was pressing her hand over her mouth, and Torres was standing with his head back and his eyes closed, and Daniela turned to Andre and said nothing. Just looked at him with an expression that contained everything that didn't need to be said. Andre looked at the screen for a long moment. He looked at the numbers that had stayed where he told them to stay. Then he sat down at the monitoring station and opened his notebook to a clean page and began writing the final verification summary, because the documentation was not finished and the work was not done until the documentation was finished, and the numbers still needed to be written down correctly, regardless of how many people were clapping in the room behind him. The public story broke on a Thursday. Andre had known it was coming. Carter had warned him, and he'd had a week to observe the increasing frequency of information requests from media organizations that were being filtered through NASA's communications office. He understood that a story like his, the specifics of it, the years and the garage and the daughter and the notebooks and the billion-dollar system, was not a story that stayed quiet. He had made his peace with that, or as close to peace as he could manage with something he had no control over. What he had not anticipated was the specific way it felt to read his own story told by other people. He read the first article on his phone in the garage on a Friday morning before Maya woke up sitting at the workbench with his coffee. The article was accurate in its facts and handled something essential in the emotional architecture of the story with more care than he'd expected. It described the 2016 report, the termination, the 9 years, the garage Maya, the notebooks. It described what NASA had confirmed in its official statement, that Andre Whitmore's analysis had identified and provided the solution framework for a critical failure mode in the RCS-7 system, preventing what the agency's internal modeling had assessed as a high-probability catastrophic failure scenario. Catastrophic failure scenario. He read that phrase 3 times. He had known when he first built the failure model in 2016 what the endpoint of the failure cascade was. He had written it in his report. He had said it in the meeting with Hartwell and Callaway, and they had looked at him and they had picked the word that served them best and called him difficult. He put the phone down on the workbench. He picked up his coffee. He sat with it for a while. Maya came downstairs at 7:15, and the moment she walked into the garage, she looked at his face and stopped. What happened? Nothing bad. He set his coffee down. Come here. She came to the workbench and he showed her the article on his phone. She read it with the focused attention she brought to everything she read, which was considerable for an 8-year-old. And when she finished, she handed the phone back to him and sat down on her stool. They spelled your name right, she said. He looked at her. They did. And they said the notebooks. She was looking at the stack of composition notebooks beneath the workbench. They said you worked on them every night. Yes. I knew about those. Her voice carried something in it, not pride exactly, but adjacent to pride. The satisfaction of someone who has known a thing was important before the world confirmed it. I always knew those were important. I know you did. She was quiet for a moment. Are people going to come here now? Probably. To the garage. Some. For a while. Maya absorbed this with the practical seriousness of a child who has grown up in a home where reality is described accurately and not softened into something easier. Okay, she said. I'll wear my good shoes. The calls and the requests and the communications that followed operated on a scale that Andre had no framework for because he had never been public before. He had been invisible before, specifically deliberately invisible, the kind of invisible that institutions create around people they want to contain, and the reversal of that was disorienting in a way he hadn't predicted. Universities. 7 of them within the first 2 weeks. Some wanted him to speak. Some wanted him to join their faculty. One dean called personally and began the conversation by saying he wanted to offer Andre whatever it would take, and Andre had to ask him to be more specific, because whatever it would take could mean many things. Engineering firms. Aerospace companies, several of which he recognized, and one of which he had once interviewed with 12 years ago before Meridian. Private space ventures run by people with more money than most nations. Defense contractors. He took all the calls. He was courteous to all of them. He did not commit to any of them because he had not yet decided what he wanted the next chapter of his life to look like, and he was not willing to let other people's enthusiasm make that decision for him. Carter called on a Sunday. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fixing a boat motor," he said. "Old man down the road. Been waiting 3 weeks. A pause. "Andre, you just saved a $3 billion spacecraft from a critical failure. You have 7 universities and 4 aerospace companies trying to get you on the phone, and you're fixing a boat motor." "Old man's been waiting 3 weeks," Andre said again. Another pause. Then Carter laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine. He'd heard her laugh before, but not like that. Not that loose. "What do you want?" she asked. "Actually want. After all of this. What does it look like?" He thought about it while he looked at the boat motor at the seized impeller housing that was the source of the problem and would take him about 40 minutes to address properly. "I want to keep fixing things," he said. "I want to keep working on hard problems. I want my daughter to grow up watching me do both of those things." He paused. "And I want the kid who submits a safety report next year and gets handed a box to have somewhere to go. Someone to call. A process that doesn't disappear the thing they found because the thing is inconvenient." "That last one," Carter said. "That's something we can actually build." "I know. Tom's office is already talking about a formal review protocol, an independent technical channel for safety concerns that bypasses the contracting relationship chain." "It needs to be real," Andre said. "Not just a channel that exists on paper, something with teeth. Something where the report goes somewhere and the person who filed it knows it went there." "I know. I'm working on it." "Work faster." She laughed again, shorter this time. "You're not easy, you know. Hartwell told me that too." "How'd that work out for Hartwell?" He picked up a wrench. "Get me a seat at the table when you build the review protocol," he said. "That's what I want." "You have it." He put the phone in his pocket and turned back to the boat motor. The formal NASA recognition came 6 weeks after the public story broke in a ceremony that Andre attended in a suit he'd bought specifically for the occasion, and that Maya had vetoed twice before approving the third option. She sat in the front row with her aunt and watched her father stand at a podium in front of 200 people and receive a commendation from Administrator Bryce that acknowledged in specific technical language that his analysis had prevented a catastrophic failure event and preserved the safety of the crewed orbital program. Maya watched the whole thing with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight. After the ceremony, a journalist from one of the major outlets found Andre and Maya in the reception area and crouched down to Maya's level and asked her if she was proud of her dad. Maya considered the question with the gravity she brought to questions that deserved gravity. "I was always proud of him," she said, "even when nobody was writing about it." The journalist looked up at Andre. Andre looked at his daughter. He had nothing to add to that. It was complete. It was the whole story compressed into 9 words by an 8-year-old in good shoes who had always known the notebooks mattered. Meridian Aerospace Systems, 2 months after the story broke, announced a comprehensive internal review of its engineering safety reporting procedures. The review was framed in a press release as a proactive commitment to safety culture, which was the kind of language that meant the thing being reviewed had been found insufficient. The announcement included the creation of a new independent technical review board that would operate outside the direct chain of command with authority to escalate safety concerns without going through program management. Andre read the announcement on his phone under the fluorescent light of his garage with a carburetor on the workbench, and Maya sitting on her stool 3 feet away, reading an engineering magazine she'd gotten from the school library. He read it twice. He put the phone down. He picked up the carburetor. "Daddy," Maya said without looking up from her magazine. "Are you okay?" "Yes," he said, and he was. Not in the way of someone who has arrived somewhere easy. In the way of someone who has finished something true and set it down carefully and is ready for whatever comes next. He went back to work. The carburetor was seized at the fuel inlet valve, which he'd suspected from the idle behavior the owner had described. He worked the valve loose with a careful application of penetrating oil and patience, and it gave way cleanly, and he rebuilt the assembly with the focused attention he brought to every broken thing that came to him, whether it was worth $3 or $3 billion. Outside, the afternoon was doing whatever the afternoon was doing. Inside the garage, a man who had been told he was only a scrap mechanic sat at his workbench and fixed what was in front of him. The same as always. The same as it had always been. The review protocol took 8 months to build. Andre knew going in that 8 months was fast for a government process, which meant Carter had pushed hard in ways he wasn't always witness to, and that Bryce had backed her in ways that carried real institutional weight. He also knew that in this context meant the work had to be done right the first time, because a safety reporting channel that existed only on paper was not a safety reporting channel. It was a box that someone could check, while the real decisions continued to be made in the same rooms where they had always been made. I was not interested in a box that someone could check. He drove to Washington 4 times during those 8 months. Each time he brought his notebooks. Each time he sat in rooms with people whose titles were long and whose calendars were full, and he said what he had to say with the same even delivery he had always used, and he did not mistake the quality of the room for permission to dilute what he knew needed to be said. The protocol that emerged from those meetings had 3 components. The first was a direct technical submission pathway, a system by which any engineer working on a NASA-contracted project could submit a formal safety concern directly to an independent review board that operated outside the contracting chain. The submission would receive a documented technical response within 30 days. Not an acknowledgement. A response. Meaning someone with credentials and authority had read the submission and addressed it on its technical merits. The second was a protection framework. An engineer who filed a submission could not be removed from their position, reassigned, or subjected to adverse personnel action within 12 months of filing without a documented review by the independent board. This was the component that had taken the longest to negotiate because it touched the contracting relationships in ways that made lawyers uncomfortable. And Andre had sat in 3 separate meetings where variations of the word complicated were used to describe it, and each time he had waited for the word to finish landing and then said the same thing. In 2016, I submitted a safety report and was terminated 6 weeks later. The system you're designing is supposed to prevent that from happening to the next person. If the protection framework has enough exceptions built into it that a company can still do what Meridian did to me and argue they were within the rules, then the framework doesn't work. Start over. The third time he said that the lead counsel from the Contracting Oversight Division put down his pen and looked at Andre for a long moment. You understand that if we make this airtight, it's going to cost some of our contractor relationships. Yes, Andre said. Some of those relationships are very large. I know. And you're still saying airtight. I'm saying airtight, Andre said. Because the next engineer who finds something real and files a report deserves to know that the report is going to go somewhere. Not maybe. Not depending on how the company feels about it. Somewhere. Every time. The counsel looked at his pen. He picked it up again. All right, he said. Airtight. The third component was a review of historical submissions. A process by which safety concerns that had been filed and not formally addressed in previous years could be resubmitted to the new board for technical review. Not for legal purposes, for the record. So that the technical knowledge contained in those submissions, knowledge that had been filtered out by institutional politics, or inconvenient timing, or simple human arrogance, could be recovered and evaluated on its merits before it became relevant in the worst possible way. Andre's 2016 report was the first submission entered into the historical review process. The board's technical response came 6 weeks later in a 12-page document that addressed every finding in Andre's original 47 pages on a technical basis and confirmed each one. The document was entered into NASA's official technical record. It was publicly accessible. Carter sent him the link on a Tuesday morning. He opened it on his phone in the garage, read the first 2 pages, and put the phone down on the workbench. Maya was at school. The garage was quiet. A diesel generator that belonged to a Baptist church 3 miles down the road was sitting in the bay, waiting for him. The pastor had called the week before, apologetic about not being able to pay full price, and Andre had told him to bring it in, and they'd figure it out. He sat at the workbench with the phone face down beside him, and looked at the wall where his tools hung at the socket sets and the wrenches and the things he had used every day for 9 years to keep broken machines running for people who needed them to run. He thought about the meeting with Hartwell and Calloway, the 47 pages on the conference table, the 30 seconds it took Hartwell to pick it up and put it back down. He thought about the box, the truck, Maya's succulent plant in the passenger seat. He thought about the first night in the garage when Maya was 5 and asleep upstairs, and the garage was cold, and he had opened a new composition notebook for the first time and written a date at the top of the first page, and kept going because stopping had never been something his mind was capable of. He sat with all of it for a while. Then he picked up the phone, opened the link again, and read the full 12 pages. When he finished, he put the phone in his pocket, picked up his tools, and went to work on the church's generator. It was a Kohler 22-kilowatt unit about 12 years old, with a carburetor issue that had been slowly degrading its output for probably the last 18 months, without anyone noticing, until it finally failed, at a moment that was inconvenient enough to force attention. The diagnosis took him 20 minutes. The repair took him an hour and 40. He tested the output 3 times before he was satisfied. He called the pastor when he was done. "Come get it whenever you're ready. She'll run clean." "Mr. Whitmore, I can't tell you what this means. We've got a seniors program that depends on that generator when the power goes." "I know. That's why I fixed it." A pause. "What do I owe you?" Andre looked at the generator running steadily in the bay. "Bring me a plate of whatever you serve at Sunday dinner," he said. "That'll do." He heard the pastor's voice change in the way that voices change when someone receives more than they expected. "I'll bring 2 plates," the pastor said. Andre smiled. It was quiet in the garage, and the generator ran smooth, and for a moment, that was the whole world, and it was enough. The first class met on a Wednesday evening in September. It wasn't a university class, though. 2 universities had offered him the rooms and the resources to do exactly this in a more formal setting. And he had declined both offers politely, because a university setting came with a university structure, and a university structure came with the same institutional layers that had defined and constrained his entire career, and he was not interested in rebuilding the ceiling. The class met in the garage. 8 people, the first Wednesday. Folding chairs set up in a rough semicircle facing the workbench. 7 young engineers, 2 from the community college in the next town over. 3 recent graduates who had found their way to him through the network that had built itself around his name in the months since the story broke, 2 who were currently employed at mid-level firms and were coming on their own time because something in what they'd read about him had made them want to hear him think out loud. And 1 high school student, 16 years old, who had driven himself 30 miles on a provisional license because his high school physics teacher had mentioned Andre's name in class, and he'd gone home and read everything he could find and then simply showed up. His name was Dominic. He sat in the back row and said almost nothing the first night, but his eyes followed everything, and Andre recognized the quality of that attention because he had felt it from the inside, his entire life. The attention of someone for whom understanding is not academic, but urgent personal necessary. Andre did not lecture. He had never been interested in lecturing in the one-directional delivery of knowledge from the person who had it to the people who didn't. What he did was work. He put a problem on the whiteboard, an actual engineering problem, not a textbook problem, drawn from the class of failure modes. He had spent his career studying, and he thought through it out loud. And when he reached a decision point, he stopped and asked the room what they saw. The first night 3 people answered. The second week 6. By the 4th week, all 8 of them were arguing with each other in the specific productive way that meant everyone in the room was thinking harder than they'd expected to think when they walked in. Dominic spoke for the first time in the 3rd week. He waited until everyone else had weighed in on the problem Andre had put on the board, and then he said in a voice that was careful with the weight of what it was carrying, "The failure point. Everyone's looking at that's not where it starts. It starts 2 steps earlier. At the load transfer junction. Everything downstream of that is just consequence." The room went quiet. Andre looked at him. "Show me," he said. Dominic stood up and walked to the whiteboard and took the marker from Andre's hand and drew 4 lines and a junction diagram. And the room watched a 16-year-old from 30 miles away demonstrate cleanly and correctly that he had seen further into the problem than 6 working engineers. When he sat back down, his face was doing the thing that faces do when a person has said something true in public for the first time and is still not sure if it was allowed. Andre looked at him steadily. "Don't ever let anyone talk you out of seeing what you see," he said. "Not a supervisor, not a VP, not a review board, not a title. What you just did is the job. Everything else is scaffolding." Dominic looked at the whiteboard, at the diagram he'd drawn. He nodded once with the particular gravity of someone recording something in the permanent part of their memory. The class grew. By December, it was 14 people, and Andre had moved the chairs to accommodate, and someone had brought a better whiteboard as an unofficial contribution, and the Wednesday evenings had taken on a quality that Andre recognized from the best version of what collaborative engineering was supposed to feel like. Not the performance of expertise, but the actual work of it, honest and demanding and shared. Patricia Moran came to one of the Wednesday sessions in November. She drove 3 hours and arrived 15 minutes early, and sat in a folding chair in the second row, and said nothing until the session was almost over. And then she raised her hand and asked a question about thermal load modeling that was so precise and so well constructed that it took the conversation somewhere new. And 2 of the engineers who had been working on the problem for the previous hour looked at each other with expressions that meant the question had opened something they hadn't seen. After the session, when everyone else had gone, she sat with Andre at the workbench, and they drank coffee from the same thermos he'd carried to the NASA facility almost a year earlier, and the conversation they had that night was the one they hadn't been able to have in 2016 when she had submitted her memo, and it had gone nowhere, and she had carried that failure with her every day since. "I should have pushed harder," she said. "You pushed. They weren't listening. I should have pushed anyway." "Patricia." He looked at her. "You filed the memo. You did what the process was supposed to allow you to do. The process failed. That's not on you." "I know it's not technically on me. I'm not talking about technically." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I'm not either." She looked at her coffee. "Do you think the new protocol will actually work?" "It'll work for some of them," he said. "The ones who file, the ones who know it exists, the ones who believe when they send the report that it's going somewhere." He paused. "The hard part isn't building the channel. The hard part is making people believe the channel is real. Because people who have been taught by experience that the channel doesn't work, they stop filing. They stop speaking. And the thing they found goes with them." "How do you change that?" "You build enough cases where someone filed and something happened," Andre said. "Where the report went somewhere and the engineer is still employed and the problem got fixed. You build that record. And then the next person who finds something and is afraid, they have evidence that it's worth it." Moran looked at him. "You're building that record," she said. "I'm trying to." She nodded slowly, turned her coffee cup in her hands. "The class," she said. "Wednesday nights, word is getting around. I know. There are people who want to formalize it, fund it, turn it into something with a name. I know that too. And I'm thinking about it." He looked at the whiteboard at the diagram Dominic had drawn 3 weeks earlier that he still hadn't erased. "I want to do it right. Whatever shape it takes, I want it to stay honest. The moment it becomes about the name or the funding or the institution, it stops being about the work. And the work is the only thing that ever mattered." Moran was quiet for a moment. "You haven't changed," she said. "Not even a little. People keep acting like that's a surprise." She smiled. It was a real one, full and tired and warm all at once. "Maybe it shouldn't be," she said. Carter called on a Friday in January, with something in her voice that was different from the project management tone Andre had come to know well across the 8 months of protocol building. "The ARC S7 crew has been announced," she said. "I saw 4 people. Mission commander is a woman named Anita Vasquez. She's been training for this for 6 years. I know who she is." "She asked about you," Carter said. "Vasquez. She read the technical summary. She asked if there was a way to talk to you." Andre looked at the garage bay at the afternoon light on the concrete floor. "Tell her I'll call her," he said. He called Vasquez on the Sunday, and they talked for an hour and 40 minutes, and it was the most direct conversation he had had with anyone since the night he and Greer had stood at the whiteboard and fixed the timing window together. Vasquez was not a woman who needed reassurance. She was a woman who needed information, and she asked for it with the directness of someone who understood precisely what the information was for. "The modification," she said. "The junction housing. You're confident in the verification." "Completely." "The resonance dampening protocol. What's the tolerance window?" he told her. She repeated the number back to him immediately, which meant she had been doing math alongside the conversation. "That's wider than the pre-modification baseline," she said. "Yes, the system is actually more stable than the original design would have been, even without the vulnerability. The modifications improved the baseline." A pause. "So we're not just flying a fixed version of a broken system. We're flying something better than the original." "That's correct." Another pause. Longer. "Mr. Whitmore," Vasquez said, "I want to say something, and I want you to hear it straight." "All right. I've been in aerospace for 19 years. I've been through 3 mission systems reviews, 2 design overhauls, and 1 abort that happened on the pad. I know what it looks like when a system is right, and when it's being made to look right." The RCS-7 documentation, the full record, including your original 2016 report. I read all of it. And I want you to know that what you did the 9 years of it, the notebook staying with the problem when every institution involved had decided to let it go. That's the reason I'm going to be comfortable getting on that platform. Andre sat with that for a moment. "Do the job well," he said. "Come back safe. That's the reason I did it." "I intend to," Vasquez said. "I know you do." They said goodbye. He put the phone down on the workbench and sat for a long time in the quiet of the garage. And what moved through him in that quiet was something that had no clean name in any language. He knew the compound emotion of a thing finally completed after 9 years of carrying it, after all the cost of carrying it, after the box and the truck and the notebooks and the cold coffee and the evenings alone and the daughter on a stool asking why the engine made that sound. He picked up a composition notebook. A new one, the cover still stiff. He opened it to the first page and wrote the date at the top. He started writing. Not failure analysis. Not resonance modeling. Something new. The outline of a curriculum for the Wednesday class built around the technical and the human both, because he had understood for a long time that they were not separable. The knowledge and the courage to use it. The math and the willingness to stand behind the math when every room in the building was telling you to sit down. The work and the person doing the work, the same thing, inseparable, each one only meaningful because of the other. He filled 6 pages before he heard Maya's footsteps on the stairs. She came into the garage and It was a Saturday morning. No school. The particular loose freedom of a Saturday. And she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at him. "You're writing in a new one," she said. "Yes." "What's in it?" "Not sure yet. Still finding out." She crossed the garage and climbed onto her stool and looked at the open page over his shoulder. She had grown, he thought, in the year since all of this had started. Not just the physical growing that children do and that parents notice and then fail to remember not noticing. Something more internal. A quality of self-possession that he recognized because he had worked his entire life to maintain it in himself against considerable pressure. And she was 9 years old, and it was already there, natural and settled, like something she'd been born with and had simply never been given a reason to doubt. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah." "At school, Marcus, he's in my class, he said his dad told him you were famous now." "What did you say?" She thought about it for a moment, swinging her legs on the stool. "I said you were the same," she said. "Famous is just other people finding out." He looked at his daughter. "I thought about a man who had walked out of a building 9 years ago carrying a cardboard box with a small succulent plant in it. A plant that was currently sitting on the windowsill of the garage and had somehow survived 9 years of inconsistent watering and variable light, and the general entropy of a working repair shop, still green, still growing. I thought about what it cost to stay true to something when the world has decided to look away from it, the price of that which is real and not romantic, and which nobody talks about honestly when they tell the story of someone who persisted. The loneliness of it. The long evenings. The specific grief of being right in a room that has decided it isn't interested in what's right. I thought about Dominic standing at the whiteboard with a marker drawing 4 lines and a junction diagram saying the failure point is 2 steps earlier, saying it in a voice that was careful with the weight of it and being correct. He thought about Vasquez looking at the RCS-7 documentation, deciding she was comfortable getting on the platform. He thought about the church generator running clean. I thought about the protocol built over 8 months, the independent channel, the protection framework, the historical review. 12 pages confirming every finding in a 47-page report, a document publicly accessible in NASA's official technical record. I thought about all of it, the full weight and span of it, and he understood not for the first time but more completely than he ever had before, that none of it was separate. Not the garage and the spacecraft. Not the notebooks and the mission, not the mechanic and the engineer, not the father and the man who had refused through 9 years of being told otherwise to stop believing that what he knew mattered. It was all one thing. It had always been one thing. "You're right," he told Maya. She nodded satisfied and picked up the engineering magazine she'd left on the workbench the day before and opened it to where she'd stopped. Andre turned back to the notebook. He picked up his pencil. Outside, the morning was going about its business. Down the road, the Baptist church's generator was running. Somewhere above the atmosphere, a platform held its modified structure in the cold of orbital space and waited for the crew that would come to it in 8 months, carried up by systems that had been made trustworthy by a man nobody expected and a problem nobody wanted to see, and 9 years of a mind that refused to let the truth go quiet. In a garage on a cracked asphalt lot, on the edge of a town that most people drove through without stopping. Andre Whitmore opened a new composition notebook and wrote the first line of the next thing he was going to build. He was not just a scrap mechanic. He had never been just a scrap mechanic. How was the man who understood that every broken thing deserved a real answer, whether it weighed 3 pounds or $3 billion, whether it sat in a repair bay or orbited the Earth at 17,000 miles an hour, whether the world was watching or whether the only witness was a child on a stool asking why the engine made that sound. He was the engineer they tried to erase, the father who refused to be diminished, the man who stayed true to what he knew, when staying true cost him everything, and who built something so solid from that truth that when the world finally came looking, it found not a ruin but a foundation, deep and certain and already holding weight. Andre Whitmore picked up his pencil and kept going. Because that was who he was. That was who he had always been. And nothing that had ever been done to him had managed to change that. Not the closed doors, not the cardboard box, not the 9 years of silence, not the rooms full of people who looked at his hands and thought they understood the limit of him. They were wrong. They had always been wrong. And the spacecraft in orbit knew it. And the 4 people who would ride it home knew it. And the child on the stool swinging her legs and reading her magazine in the quiet of a Saturday morning had known it longest of all.